Stephen Runciman's 1951 History of the Crusades is nowadays regarded with some scepticism by serious scholars, but it's the one I was raised on, and it's well written, livened up in the style of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, with lots of curious details and sidebar narratives. For cynics, the story of the Children's Crusade is especially satisfying. This crusade was led by Stephen of Cloy, a shepherd boy of about 12 years old, according to Runciman. This lad had seen Christ in a vision. The Saviour told him to preach the crusade, so off he went. The King of France was not very sympathetic, but by the end of June AD 1212, Stephen was at the city of Vendôme in north-central France with 30,000 followers. Not one over 12 years of age, says Runciman. Stephen led them all to Marseille on the south coast, where, he said, the sea would part so they could walk to Palestine. This unaccountably failed to happen, but two merchants of Marseille, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, put 7 ships at their disposal free of charge. For the glory of God, they said, and the Children's Crusade set sail for the Holy Land. It turned out these two merchants were in cahoots with the Muslim slave traders of North Africa. The pre-teen pilgrims ended up in the slave markets of Algeria, Egypt and Baghdad. Runciman doesn't tell us what happened to Stephen himself. Presumably he was enslaved with the rest of the kiddies. Last weekend's March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C. naturally brought the Children's Crusade to mind. The numbers were bigger, 180,000 according to the New York Times. If you scale for populations relative to the 13th century, though, they were likely comparable. And, to judge by mainstream media accounts, children were certainly to the fore. By those accounts, this was, in fact, an uprising of the nation's youth against an entrenched, gun-loving establishment of evil old white men. "Welcome to the revolution!" screeched 17-year-old Cameron Kasky to the assembled thousands. Quote from the New York Times story. Planning for the events was spearheaded by a group of students from Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, who have emerged as national anti-gun figures in the wake of the shooting that left 17 dead. End quote. Ah, the idealism of youth. Is there anything in this Children's Crusade to gladden the stony hearts of cynics? You bet there is. If you've been wondering how a bunch of adolescents could manage the funding and organisation of this march and similar events nationwide, allow me to direct you to Daniel Greenfield's excellent bit of investigative reporting over at Front Page. Greenfield has done the spade work the mainstream media will not do, and he has uncovered the men behind the curtain. Sample quote: "March for Our Lives is funded by Hollywood celebs. It's led by a Hollywood producer, and its finances are routed through an obscure tax firm in California's San Fernando Valley. Its treasurer and secretary are Washington, D.C. pros. And a top funder of gun control agendas is also one of its directors." End quote. As Greenfield points out, the deliberate obscurity and obfuscation behind the organisation and funding of the march makes a sorry contrast with the National Rifle Association. Further quote from him: "The NRA is maligned 24/7, and yet it's completely obvious whom it represents. It represents its 5 million members. Anti-gun groups tend to represent shadowy networks." End quote. And in fact, the impression you got from mainstream media accounts, the impression I definitely got, that the Washington March was of youngsters, which is why I found myself thinking about the Children's Crusade, that impression is false. An academic sociologist analysed the crowd and concluded that no more than 10% were under 18. The average age was 49. To be fair to the media, this lady's research was published in the Washington Post, but only as an op-ed. You'd never have figured those facts from the news stories. For a further dash of cynicism, note how, as always with these SJW glove puppets, how the loud heralded revolution turns out not to threaten anyone who actually holds actual power. Nitwits like that 17-year-old Cameron Kasky really seem to think they are sticking it to the man, when, as Ramsay Paul jeered on another occasion, "You are the man." Similarly with 17-year-old David Hogg, the foul-mouthed young twerp who seems to fancy himself the Stephen of Cloy in this children's crusade of 49-year-olds.
Now, who here is
going to vote in the
2018
2018 election, he asks the crowd. If you listen real close, you can hear the people in power shaking. End quote.
We're going to make sure the best people get...
No, David. What has the people in power shaking is the thought that if, as their hearts desire, they were to stage a coup and establish a Chinese-style panopticon of thought control and repression of dissent, they might find themselves opposed by millions of armed citizens. That's what has them shaking, David. These self-styled revolutionaries believe everything that those people in power believe. Everything that billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg believe. Everything that every corporate HR director believes. Everything the academics and church leaders and media talking heads and Hollywood glitterati believe. If this is revolution, Louis XVI and Tsar Nicholas II were foaming revolutionaries. What I want to know is, where are Hugh the Iron and William the Pig when we really need them?